Welcome to Launch.json, the gatekeeper to BC development. Hey, I'm Eric, and whenever we create a project in Visual Studio Code, we get a file called Launch.json. Launch.json is the file that describes how do we connect to any type of Business Central. It defines your connection to the world. It defines how you see Business Central. So I thought, let's do a video on what's actually in the Launch.json or what you can do with it. And it all starts here. Here's a completely empty Visual Studio Code entry. So I will do the classic one and go into the command palette and execute the algo command. You'll see me doing this a million times on the channel. If not, get subscribed and you'll see me create a lot of projects. I specify a folder somewhere. We call this Launch.json. Specify an empty folder. I specify a folder that does not exist, so it will create it as an empty folder. I also specify what is my target platform. I think I'll go with a version 19 right now. And we get some stuff. And then it asks me to choose the server. So what you actually do here is that now Business Central, or actually Visual Studio Code or the compiler, will populate your Launch.json with a profile, with a configuration. And the two options, Microsoft Cloud Sandbox or your own server. Let's go with Microsoft Cloud Sandbox, see what we get. So as the name implies, what we get is a JSON file. And we can see that there's a version number which we really have it has no impact on anything. So just ignore that one. And then we have an array of configurations. And we can see now we got one configuration here. And let's just walk through what we have in this, because the first field is not, well, the most important field to begin with is actually the type, because again, we're inside Visual Studio Code, so we could do C#, .NET projects, we could do Node projects, we could do PHP projects, we do all sorts of projects. So the launch configuration needs to know that this one is actually an AL launch. Then we can start from the top, and so it has a name, and the name is important because the name will be displayed on your screen when you do stuff. So Microsoft Cloud Sandbox, that might not be the best way. So I could say that I have a sandbox. I call it ACS. So if I go to a browser and I go somewhere and do just type / it's right here. I go to my sandbox. I log in. So we can see up here we have I have my tenant ID and I have a name of the sandbox. So now I've just copied a tenant ID into this one. So the name is just a name, but the name is very important for us to actually see what goes on. We'll get back to the request type at a bit later. So for now, we can just do launch. So we can launch something to the sandbox, but in reality we're using this configuration for more stuff than just launch. So we have an environment type, so we can tell that this is a sandbox. Can we tell that this is anything else? Yes, we can. We can tell that it's a on-prem system and we can tell it's a production system, but we cannot develop to production. So let's save that one together with the request one for just a second. We'll just stay at the sandbox because that's what we're trying to talk to right now. Then we need to specify the environment name, and in this case my environment name is ACS. So I will specify ACS in the environment name. In this configuration we're missing a field, so I'm gonna add another line here called tenant, and in that one, because I'm a partner, so I often work with delegate admin access to multiple customer systems, so I always put in the GUID in the tenant. So you can also do the I could also go with something like hogarth.onmicrosoft.com, but for some reason I have stuck with the GUIDs, so I do that. Then we have a startup objects, we'll get back to that also, and we have some debugging fields. So if we kind of separate those into different sections. So the first piece we have up here is what is it that we do. So we can launch through and we can do an AL launch, and we call the sandbox. What we're connecting to is a cloud sandbox on this tenant called ACS. So now that I have done this, I can save, and then I can try to get symbols. So I get an authentication thing here, and I authenticate, and we get symbols. So where did it know how or where to get symbols? Well, at this point it just looked at our configurations, and we only have one, so we'll just use the one. But we can have more than one. So even though we didn't do a launch, we still use this configuration, even though it's type launch, that we use this to get symbols. So in reality, the only information really used to get the symbols are the name of the destination. If I hit, and that's behind my face down here, let's see if we can, oh wow, that's not very practical. Let's see if we can, you see there's an add configuration. So if I hit add configuration, we get a bunch of, hey, you can add all these different configurations. So we can add .NET stuff, we can add AL stuff, we can add some Chrome, some Edge, and a bunch of nodes, and I think that's pretty much it on my machine at least, depending on what extension you have installed in your VS Code. So we can see that the one we did, remember the dialog we got in the start saying, do you want to use on Cloud Sandbox or on-prem something? So if I do publish to your own server here, see now we got a new configuration. So now we have two configurations in our Launch.json. So we can give this one a different name. So we can say Docker, and I think I have a Docker called BC19 on this. So type is still AL, request is launch, environment type is on-prem. So now I need to instead of here where we got an environment type sandbox and we just specify the tenant and the environment name, now we specify something more. We can separate these again just to kind of look at, see what goes together. So in this case, I think my server is called BC19, just to make it easy. And the instance server instance on this on-prem server is called BC, and I do user password authentication. So if this was a a server that had used Windows authentication, I will specify that. If this is a server that used on-prem server but using AAD authentication, I could specify that. But I'll just go with user password in this case. So now I'm going to download symbols again. Download symbols. And you see now I got a choice. Please choose the server. Because now we have two configurations specified. So we have the sandbox ACS and the Docker BC. So if I take the Docker BC, I get some symbols, and we can see that now I actually have two sets of symbols because the revision is not the exact same thing here. So one of them is just a tiny bit newer. So now I have doubled symbols. The L compiler will grab the newest one and look at that one, so it will actually ignore the other ones, but you should clean that up once in a while. So multiple configurations. If I were to, let me just make sure that I can call this one something like that. If I hit a 5 to publish, now I get a choice again. So every time now, because we have more than one configuration in our system, we will get the option of which configuration to use. So I will use Docker in this case. And this is where you get the dialog twice, because the first time you publish, it kind of go out and check that you have the latest symbols, and then you go again to actually deploy it. This is kind of weird. I never understood why it want to go grab symbols again, but it does. Okay, so now I want to show you something else, because remember we had the name, and that's very convenient when we have the dialogues saying, hey, what server do you want? So just not Cloud Sandbox, Cloud Sandbox, Cloud Sandbox, or on-prem. But you can also see here in the debugger page, we can see we're which one do we wanna work with? Well, we can stop the debugger again here, and then I can say, hey, go to Docker and deploy to that one. So it's kind of in the UI also here. And we can see that it's also down here. So the name is very convenient, and you should always update that one if you're running with multiple configurations. Okay, so in this case, I debugged, and I hit a 5 and it compiled, it deployed, and then it opened the browser somewhere. Well, that somewhere is actually defined in here. So let's actually just go back and reorder these lines just a bit more. It's kind of weird that, you see the on-prem does not specify that the startup object type is a page, but the cloud template does. It seems like an oversight. Anyway, so we have these three fields: start object type and start object ID. So whenever you hit a 5 and you launch the browser, what object should it try to load? And you have a choice between page, query, report, and table. And then you specify the object type and you specify the object number. You can also specify that, hey, don't launch the browser, but that only works if you're doing Control F5. Not if you, this setting is ignored if you're debugging. Then it will always start the browser in order to connect the debugging ID. So what happens here? Let me actually show you that. So the way this works, let's see if I can explain this in a meaningful way. So I connect, I've hit a 5, so I want to debug. So I select the configuration. So now we have a debugging session. And so this specific session we have up here is the one that the server knows that we're debugging. So that's the one that the VS Code is connected to. So if you do something else, like go up here and then you reload again, so you kind of get a new session, then you're no longer debugging. So whatever the session you think you're debugging here is no longer connected, because you have gone away from that session in the browser. So those are the startup objects IDs. Then we have a bunch of and there's actually a tenant also for on-prem if you're running a multi-tenant setup on-prem. Then we have a bunch of settings to control the debugger. Should we break on errors? Should we break on whenever you're actually writing a record? Do you want secret information in the debugger? Do you want long-running SQL statements in the debug window? What is the threshold for this, and number of SQL statements? I very rarely actually use this, but you can. And there's a slight difference between what it offers up here in the on-prem setting and the cloud setting. I have no clue if that's because we cannot touch the other values anyway in the cloud. Anyway, so those are Launch configuration, but remember we actually had more. So if we go back in here again, then we have a way so that we can so we have looked at the one called publish. Now we're going to look at the one called attach. So you can see that now the request type is attached. It's no longer launch. Again, we have the same thing. So let me just do BC19 here, and then we will do attach BC. So if I go and say I want to download symbols, well, that didn't work. Sometimes they will actually show up. I think they did that in an earlier version. Okay, never mind. Carry on, Eric. So an attach is a way to connect the debugger without deploying code. And attach works, you see, most of these are exactly the same, but there's one new here. There's one new setting called break on next. Meaning, so where should we hook up the debugger? So in this case, it says web service client, meaning that the next, so if we connect this one, so if I do an F5 now, and I select my attach thing here, then we can see the debugger is started. We don't get the web browser because that makes no sense. So now it's waiting for the next web service client, so the next web service call that is made into BC, and maybe we can actually simulate that. Let's see if we can do that. We go to web services. I don't know if I have a and I select something random, sales dashboard. Maybe we then need to go to users. No, sorry, I can just go like this. And nothing. There were no breakpoints in that one. So you see now it stopped the debugger because we completed this thing. There were no breakpoints. There were no arrows, so there was nothing to break on. So that's attach. Then let's try the let's try a look at the last one. And the last two are to initialize a snapshot debugging session. So if we select one of these, we can see that those are slightly different. There's less information. The request is now a snapshot initialize, and in this case, we can connect to production. Remember, we had production as an option environment type, and now we tried cloud and we tried on-prem, but now we have production. So because we have the very specific scenario with the snapshot debugger, and I'm not going to do snapshot debugging here. There's a whole video on snapshot debugging. Check it out. But in this case, this is the reason why we can specify production as the environment type. And we have some options here that, again, what is it that we want to snapshot on? And I think there's another option here. Anyway, go check out the snapshot debugging video instead, because otherwise I'm already over 20 minutes here. So, but the same thing goes with the snapshot here, that you will probably want to grab, the tenant ID, so you make sure that you are actually using the right tenant, and snapshot debug production, something like that. So you have the names available so you can see what happens. In case of customers with multiple sandboxes for different environments, and you want to be able to debug them, you might have a configuration for each sandbox or stuff like that. So that's Launch.json, and it's a vital file because that's the interface to whatever you're working on, and it's pretty self-explanatory, but there are make sure that you always add the tenant in, so you're not suddenly deploying your app to a different, a sandbox called sandbox, but at a different customer or stuff like that. That's pretty bad. Anyway, if you think I missed something about Launch.json, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, this video has been selected specifically by the almighty YouTube algorithm, and they think that this is the one for you. So go check that out. See you there. Take care. Bye.